Thank you so much, Kirk, for the kind introduction. And thank you all for being here today, and thank you for inviting me out to Seattle. This is really an honor to be up here in front of all of you. Can you hear me all right? Is that better? Okay. And I didn't hear Andy say anything about no forging, so I think we can do some forging today. So my presentation today is going to be a loose navigation of my work and the influences that have helped me along the way. I consider these being divided into three categories, my work that is. First, there's production tool making. I make small batches of tools, primarily for fellow craftsmen and women. Included in these are several different types of hammers and saws, jeweler saws, fret saws, and measuring tools. I do believe that creating with tools that not only work well but are beautiful in their own right enhances our experience in the studio and shop. And I try and offer tools that fit this description. The second category is commission work. These jobs usually have certain constraints to them due to the client, which I have to say I've been really lucky and been able to work with some great clients and customers over the years, open to do what I'm interested in doing. But they've been in the forms of locks and tools and custom door hardware and all sorts of things. And lastly, I guess this would be speculative work. Objects that are created entirely from my own interest in a certain subject, technique, or idea. Recently, this has been in the form of locks and boxes. And this is definitely where I feel that I've grown most as a maker and pushed myself the most to learn new things. All of these three categories, they kind of flow into one another and they influence each other, and they really are kind of the same, but ultimately I keep them separate in my mind, and that kind of allows me to push boundaries and set parameters as I need to. Currently I work out of a 2-car garage that I converted into a shop. January of this year it looked like this, and yesterday it looked like that. On one side is this forging area, and you can see my main bench at the end there. Backs on her books. And a planishing hammer. And so each of these have raised wire inlay in fine silver. And both of these last two hammers have iron bodies with steel faces that have been forge welded on. The steel faces can be hardened and tempered for toughness, like I talked about earlier. But the iron body stays soft and is more easily carved, great for inlay and engraving. This is a historical technique, and it's seen in many iron tools before the 20th century. And it was actually done because steel was more expensive than iron. And so labor was really cheap, so they would use less steel, even though it took longer to make. This is a jeweler's saw with fine silver inlay. And these pure iron measuring tools, dividers in a square, and they're inlaid with mokomegane that's made out of copper and pure iron and some fine silver as well. And a duck press. This is a duck press, and on the vertical post there you can see that half round copper inlaid. And I have used this duck press. It was a great meal. And I'm really not a jeweler, but when you want to look good, either pressing duck or chopping meat, you've got to go with the sausage inlay broach. So in 2017, I received an international research grant through the Leighton International Artist Exchange Program, and I returned to Japan for a longer trip. This time it was for 6 weeks, and I studied with artists that we had met on the first trip. Kind of a side note, it was really interesting to travel with Hiroko on that first trip, because there were artists that she wasn't able to meet growing up, or able to walk into their studios because of where she came from, and being a woman in Japan, frankly. And so years later, when she brought myself and a friend, Jack Mach, to travel with her, she was able to see and meet a lot of these artists because we were there, because we were American metalsmiths coming to America, and so it was kind of a symbiotic trip in that way. So she was able to form relationships through us being there, and it obviously was beneficial to us as well. So years later, I was able to return to Japan and study with these people. And I could easily give an hour-long presentation on this trip alone, because I worked with several of those artists on raising, engraving, inlay, overlay, patination, gilding, making traditional tobacco pipes. But I chose to just talk about a few here today. This is Ueno-san. He's a metalsmith in Tsubame City, and he's known for his teapots and other hollowware. You can see in front of him is some of his work. There's some large mokume vessels there, some double-spouted teapots, if you look right in front, or one double-spouted teapot. And then those bowls, it's kind of hard to convey the elegance of those bowls unless you have them in person. But he showed us the first time we visited how he makes those, and he raises those out of a 14 millimeter thick piece of shikuishi. He uses his toe to support it as he's hammering. So the teapots he makes are raised out of a single sheet. This is actually a picture from that hollowware company I mentioned earlier, but you can see the progression starting with a round sheet. Ueno-san actually starts with an oval sheet and going around. And this is one of his finished teapots. This is raised from a sheet of mokume gane, which actually, coincidentally, Hiroko and I made that mokume gane for him, so that's kind of special. And this is in a show at the Penland Gallery right now. If anyone was at SNAG this year in Chicago, there was a preview of this metalsmithing show. But right now it's up at the Penland Gallery, and I have to say it's a really, really stunning show. And it shows work that we just don't see in the US. So, by any chance you're coming east, check it out. And so, this is a traditional form with the spout raised out of the body, but Ueno-san's kind of little tweak on this is that he also raises those little ears that the handles are attached to. Normally those would be added on afterwards. So that's his like big contemporary innovation. It sounds small, but on a traditional technique that's hundreds of years old, it's kind of a big deal. So having the opportunity to work with Ueno-san was really an eye-opening experience. I've never seen someone who is so in tune with their material. This is kind of partway through the raising process of these teapots. Ueno-san is, I believe he's getting into his late 80s. And he still makes 3 of these teapots a month. And he gave me a real appreciation of what it means to master one's craft. And I think this is like a mastery that only happens in your mid to late 80s after you've been doing this since you were 13 years old. And in this way, it was a really humbling experience. And I guess it's a reminder that although many of us consider ourselves really good at what we do, maybe even experts, that there's still individuals from a generation that have a deeper understanding of their process and materials than most of us can really ever hope to have. And I just point that out to highlight Ueno-san and really put him up there. I feel really lucky that I got to spend that time with him and experience that skill firsthand. And this is a little bit of a side note, but an interesting observation I had while I was studying with Ueno-san is that the towns of Tsubame and Sanjo, which are kind of towns together where he works, they're known for their hollowware due to their rich copper mines back in history. And while I was there, I observed that there were really contemporary industrial technologies being used at the same time as traditional handwork. And both of these were totally valued. There were EDM machines and punch presses being used right down the street from that company Gyokusendo, who had been open for 250 years, making hollowware, and Ueno-san. And I guess this just all felt very refreshing in our country, where once the newest technology is introduced, the old one is forgotten, and you are forgotten. So, I also worked with a Tokyo artist named Kashima-san. I worked with him to learn a technique called Nunome Zogan. This is a technique that, Nunome Zogan is kind of the umbrella technique, but the style Kashima Nunome Zogan is his family's technique. And this is a technique used to apply ornamentation onto the surface of metal. This involves using a thin chisel struck in a vertical position to create a crosshatch pattern in multiple directions, either 3 or 4 directions, onto a base metal. Once that ground is laid, the foil can then be pushed into the teeth. And once all the foil is applied, it's then burnished to adhere to the metal. And this is a sample I made while working with Kashima-san. And the base metal is brass with fine silver, 18 karat and 24 karat. This is definitely one of my favorite samples from Kashima-san's. It shows how he uses different alloys of gold to create gradations in his work. So he can line those up in his work and create these really incredible gradations. And that goes from, I think 0 is actually lead, and then 12 karat up to 24 karat. I also worked with a gentleman named Seisei Asai, and in his studio I learned uchidashi, which is a type of chasing in repoussé to create small ornaments like the one seen here. This would be called an obujime, which is for the kimono, for like basically a belt buckle for the kimono. But the same technique would be used to create all sorts of sword ornaments and things of that nature. And they're usually formed in a really kind of unique way. It's not just a Western style of chasing and repoussé that we know. They're able to really thicken the material as they raise it, as they chase it in. And they'd be formed and then they'd be inlaid, engraved, oftentimes gilded. And then using traditional patinas like rokusho, the color would be brought up. So like on this one, it would probably be a base of fine silver, and the dark is shakudo, and the gray is shibuishi, and the gold you see would be gilded, a very light color of gold gilded. And rokusho is made from cupric sulfate, malachite, and water. You boil those together and put your piece in it, and the color of the finished piece is affected by the time cooked, the strength of the rokusho, and the alloys. And so this, along with the alloys like shakudo, shibuishi, kuromido, this patina is what gives Japanese metalwork its really unique palette. To illustrate that, this is a small sample that I made as an experiment in inlay and carving. The base metal is copper, and the bird is shakudo, and you can see the 2 bands on its arms are then shibuishi and fine silver. So after returning from this trip, I had a lot to process. I learned a lot of techniques, worked with a lot of people, and I had wanted to figure out how that was going to start to play into my work. And Nuno Mezogan seemed like it made the most sense for what I was making at the time. This is a little brass and steel container. It's maybe 4 inches across, and it's got fine silver Nuno Mezogan pattern across it. And the techniques really, I find it really meditative. I mean, the chiseling is really meditative, and then actually laying down of the foil is really meditative. And I love how the pattern can kind of develop as you go, and you can see different layers of it, and it'll inspire, seeing these things step by step inspires me to try different patterns in the future. So I've begun to apply this to some tools. Big surprise, right? And this is a planishing hammer with 24 karat, and also a chasing hammer. And unlike the previous ornament, which those hexagons, I cut out each one and then applied it, and applied strips. These 2 hammers, I apply an entire sheet of 24 karat and then remove the background to make a pattern. Both of these hammers also are iron with welded faces, so they make for really nice chiseling. And most recently I finished this padlock. This is a forged and filed padlock from wrought iron. It's got 24 karat ornament, and it's adhered to a copper plaque, which has then been treated with a rokusho patina. And I feel like this is the beginning of what has been quite a few years in the making. I've had it on my mind for many years now, but I feel like I'm finally starting to pair these 2 major influences of Western ironwork and Japanese metalwork. And I'm really excited to pursue this work, which I hope will have more color, more materials, and ultimately be a bit more nuanced than the work previous to this. This is in that show in the Penland Gallery right now. Come see it. All right, the coffer. So in 2015, after working full-time for a few years on commission work and beginning to develop some production tools, I decided to apply to Penland's 3-year residency to make work that would take more time, research, and exploration than I was able to dedicate as an independent metalsmith. I've been working in Cleveland for about 3 years, and I've been making some of those production tools, all those commissions, and was getting to do a little bit of my own work. But I felt like at this time in my career it would be a really wonderful opportunity to create some work that could kind of set a tone for what I want to do in the future. And so I got accepted and got to move back to Penland. And the Resident Artist Program is a great program. It's they give you a studio, and you get to set up shop there. You get room, place to stay. I moved back with my wife, and you get partial meals at the dining hall. And for 3 years, basically, the only thing you have to do is have an open door policy. And so the idea had begun to sneak into my mind that I might work on a single piece over the course of this 3 years. Since early on, coffers had intrigued me. It's a historical form type of lock. They're essentially an early safe that have a multiple bolt lock mounted on the inside of the lid. And up until this point, I didn't feel that I had the skill to execute such a project, like such an enormous project. But with the residency in front of me, I felt that I found myself feeling that it was actually within my reach. And I guess maybe I was kind of thinking that if I were to have a journeyman's test, this was the opportunity. And so over the course of the next 3 years, I began to work on this piece. And I worked on this for about half of the time in the studio. Essentially, my schedule was Monday through Sunday, and mornings were spent on production work, and afternoons and evenings and weekends were spent entirely on this and some other pieces I made during that time, like that puzzle box. Design for the coffer started by researching collections in person and in books and online. Primarily, I was looking at blockwork, European blockwork mostly, that was made between the 17th and 19th centuries. The goal here was not to gather information in an effort to historically reproduce an object or a style or motif, but instead it was basically just to familiarize myself with mechanisms, get an idea of how this thing could work, should work. I do not disregard the aesthetics of this work, as it's obvious I'm very drawn to them as well. But when I work like this, when I research like this, I simply try and absorb the visual information. And then, as I begin designing, sometimes referencing a certain line or curve, I hope that the aspects I was first drawn to will just kind of be distilled, and I trust my judgment and decisions in my design, and hope that something unique to myself comes out of that. As with everything, it begins with a drawing. I make a lot of kind of detailed sketches of parts as I go. You know, if I'm making a certain bolt or spring or things like that, I might make a detailed sketch of how I want it to look. But as for technical drawings, this was it. And I think my finished work tends to be could be viewed as highly engineered. And I actually work in a pretty unplanned and organic way, which is how I like working. And this really goes back to my influence from Peter and working in a pre-industrial revolution mindset. One part is made, and the next is fit to that, and so on and so forth. There are no interchangeable parts, and each has its specific place down to every screw. I think that we maybe have been conditioned to work in certain tolerances in terms of repeatability, kind of our default in life often, culturally, is to think that we have interchangeable parts, whether that be that plastic part on that coffee mug or whatever part. But I think that working in small numbers, creating a piece can be a lot more enjoyable when it's not so rigid. And often it can be more efficient. And again, I don't choose to work this way because it's period appropriate, but because it just makes more sense for this type of work in construction. And ultimately, I find this way of working a lot more enjoyable. Something that happened along the way, which I didn't really recognize until the end, was how the visual language I developed in the beginning helped dictate design decisions in the end. Case in point, these file details, which are called a lamb's tongue in woodworking, are on the standoffs of the main movement of the lock, and are some of the first pieces I made. Those are on the left. And then fast forward 2 years, and I'm making the feet, and it just made a lot of sense to put the same detail into that. So as with the rest of my work, all the components were made primarily through handwork at the forge and the bench, making the forgings as close to the finished product as possible. These are the levers that help drive the locking mechanism. The forgings underneath, finished on top. And the majority of the coffer is made from wrought iron. Wrought is a material that I use mostly for its working properties. It's particularly nice to file and really, really likes to be forge welded. Wrought iron is not manufactured anymore. It was stopped being manufactured around the turn of the century. And so all of these pieces needed to be forged from salvaged material. So it did feel pretty ridiculous that I was forging out wrought iron to make a 1/4 by 1 inch bar that I had to file, but you can see it actually has a grain structure. Maybe you can see kind of in these photos that it has a bit of a grain structure. It's different. It's not an amalgamous material. And so it gave the lock a look it wouldn't normally have, the entire piece a look it wouldn't normally have. So the other major components of the coffer include screws and springs and keys and molding. And so each of the screws, which this is just a very few shown here, are made between a combination of handwork and working on the lathe. And I don't recall the exact number, but there's definitely over 200 screws that I made for this lock. And that, yeah, 200 fasteners I made. That doesn't include rivets, which probably outnumber that. The springs are made from high carbon steel, so they can be heat treated. And I would start as flat sheet, I would polish them, form them into the spring shape, harden them, temper them, and then polish them again. And really, like from the forming to the machining to the heat treating, the coffer made me pull out kind of all the stops. I had to use all my tools. And so, like for example, the chasing and repoussé of this ward box cover out of pure iron. I really, pulled out all the tools that I had to be able to do this. The keys are each fabricated out of 3 pieces. The bows are wrapped and forge welded, and then the bit of the key, which is what operates in the lock, is forged from solid material. And then the stem, and what's called the barrel, is made by forging the size material I need, machining a tube out of it, hot forging it, triangular, and then cold chasing it concave, so it turns into that concave triangle. This is first fitting of that key. This was wanting to expose more of this mechanism for the viewer to see, but I do enjoy, there's kind of this thing about having it hidden. Perhaps for another craftsman to see many years down the road when it has to be worked on. It'll never have to be worked on. And so this piece was a really, really important piece for my growth as a maker, technically, mentally, and otherwise. And I have to thank Penland for taking me on as a resident artist, providing me with a place and a space to take on such a big project. And there were a lot of people who supported me along the way. And so the last thing I'd like to share is a video that I commissioned made by filmmaker Jesse Beecher. And this is something that I wanted to have not only to serve as a record of the finished coffer and its operation, but also to help people understand what went into this and making this sort of work. you.